Welcome, everyone. My name is Romina De Angelis, and I am a social and qualitative research methods specialist at Statistics for Sustainable Development. In this session, we will look at the qualitative research methods and approaches that help foster just knowledge practices within agroecology. In particular, we will look firstly at two practical examples which will set the background for our group discussion. Then we will introduce the notions of epistemic injustice and then relate those to the research approaches that help foster just practices. Additionally, we will link those research approaches to existing work within CCRP, such as the work conducted within farmer research networks. Finally, we will think of some ideas for future steps that we can practically take within our work and share some final remarks or ask questions in the end. The first example relates to my own experience living and working within a tribal community in the Indian Himalayas. In particular, this community sort of rescued children from disadvantaged backgrounds or orphans and provided them with progressive education methods combined together with more traditional training into local cultural practices. I will specifically look at three aspects within this experience. Firstly, there was the fact that within the community, during out of school time, children were engaged in activities such as breaking rocks or construction work, which were usually activities conducted by adults in the surrounding villages. The second aspect has to do with the fact that local members of the community were carrying heavy bags with resources for the construction work sites. They were walking uphill carrying these heavy weights. And the third aspect has to do with practices employed in the community kitchen. In all three cases, both I and other international volunteers thought that there were better ways of doing things based on our Eurocentric perspective. That is to say, a Eurocentric perspective is one where you value your own cultural system or your own system of knowledge as being above other systems of knowledge. So in this case, in the first instance, we thought that children during out of school time should have been engaged into more children-like activities such as playing games. And in the second case, we thought that because the community had a truck, they could have loaded the truck with the resources that they needed uphill in the construction site, rather than having individual members having bags on their backs. And in the third instance, in the community kitchen, they used to cut cabbage using knives. And we thought that, for example, a vegetable grater would have made that activity easier, more efficient, or less effortful for community members. We then communicated our ideas to community members, but this situation escalated to a point where what these activities meant to me was in contrast with the way they were interpreted by the community. And the community leader summoned me and other international volunteers to his office late at night and told us that our interventions were being disruptive to the community and that in the first case, children needed to learn those skills in breaking rocks and doing construction work because they could have been useful to them in case they wanted to be employed in the surrounding villages after leaving the community, as we should not have expected that every student would have pursued higher education. In the second case, they explained that although the community did have a truck, it would have been a waste of fuel for them to use it within the community compound because fuel was quite expensive and not easy to find that altitude. And thirdly, the example of having more efficient ways to use in the kitchen, we were told that conducting the activity of chopping cabbage together just with using knives with more community members helped them build a sense of community and share time together. And us suggesting to do it otherwise was a very disruptive way. So being summoned to this meeting was very helpful for me to start questioning my own approach and my own way of interpreting things as compared to the way locals interpret things. The second example has to do with a critical analysis of a development project that was introduced in rural areas in Mozambique. In particular, it is taken from a paper that critically analyzed a livestock development project in rural Mozambique, where among the aims of the project, there was the aspect of changing the mindset of local goat keepers so that they would be able to make a profit from selling goats. In particular, the implementation of the project introduced the use of a scale in order to determine the price of goats based on their weight. This initiative, though, was met with resistance by local goat keepers as they were used to local practices of price agreements between individual producers and consumers, which were governed by the time of the year, whether the buyer was a community member or an outsider, and whether the sale occurred during the time of emergency. Price agreements did not work based on the capitalist market model, but based on the greater good for the community, where households who faced difficulties were supported with prices that were more fair to their situation. Similarly, during this project, capacity building on improving the profitability of goats was organized with the aim of changing local practices, which were labeled as being ad hoc or risky or informal, into more market-led activities, and these trainings were organized without including the existing knowledge of local goat keepers. Another aspect of this development project had to do with the introduction of an innovation platform, and the concept itself of innovation platform could not even be translated into the local language, and it was completely unknown to the local knowledge system. In fact, local members of the community, were expected to understand the principles of how an innovation platform functions so that the project team could then hand it over to them after some time, and then without even taking into consideration the fact that they may have had other local ways of taking decisions. One example of local ways of taking decisions is the one called palaver, where community members engage into discussions until they all agree a consensus on the decision to be taken. And lastly, at the end of the intervention, a sociological study was conducted. And in the analysis of the data, categories were assigned to the data, again based on a capitalist imposed framework, such as, for example, goats considered as contributors to social capital, or goats being considered as commercial production commodities, rather than instead framing these categories according to the indigenous ways of knowing. For instance, the fact that goals were used to support each other during times of emergencies or when a family was in need. So finally, after having looked at these examples, based on the critical analysis that was conducted for the development project in Mozambique, there can be 5 main problematic areas that we can identify. So firstly, there is the fact of imposing an idea of development that is strongly rooted within Eurocentric thinking. And here the concept of Eurocentric thinking needs a little bit of unpacking. When we talk about Eurocentric thinking, we mean a view of Western civilization that refers mainly to the development occurred within Europe and North America, which is held as being the standard or the preferred way of doing things. So when we talk about imposing a Eurocentric view or like a Eurocentric approach, we talk about imposing a view that comes from Western civilization, which is a process that disregards the existing knowledge and tradition, for example, of the Mompa community in the Indian examples provided first, or the rural community in Mozambique. Another aspect that was problematic in these examples was the fact of considering participants just as being beneficiaries of knowledge, which once again disregards the fact that they already carry their own local knowledge, which they could share with us. A third aspect has to do with organizing capacity building activities and trainings based once again on Eurocentric concepts. So once again, holding the standard of the Western civilization as the most acceptable standard, without even considering that participants' knowledge could be used or could be incorporated into conducting capacity building. Fourth aspect has to do with using, for example, the notion of innovative platform, where a market-led development approach or a notion of inclusion is limited to just not really involving taking into consideration everyone's perspective, but just making sure that there are representatives of marginalized groups within meetings, but without their voices really being heard. And a final aspect has to do with the fact that when we conduct research about the community, if we frame it within Eurocentric conceptual framework instead of using local ones, we may end up analyzing data or coming up with findings that are not really locally relevant. So in view of these examples and the problems that we mentioned, I would like for us to take a couple of minutes for each of us to think of similar experiences that we have encountered in our practices, and then share them with the groups for discussion. After having discussed our experiences and based on the examples shared, I would like to introduce briefly some theoretical notions in relation to epistemic injustice. So first of all, it would be once again good to unpack the notion of epistemic injustice. So, what do we talk about when we refer to the word epistemic? So, anything related to epistemic has to do with knowledge or to the degree of its validation. Hence, when we talk about epistemic injustice, we are talking about injustice that has to do with knowledge or the holders of knowledge. In particular, it has to do with the process of undermining the capacity of people to engage in practices where they are able to share knowledge, provide knowledge for others, or even to make sense of their own experiences. Specifically, the British philosopher Miranda Fricker developed the concepts of hermeneutical injustice, which refers to a lack of resources related to language and concepts at a collective or structural level, which puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when they are trying to understand or even communicate their social experiences. An example can be a woman that experiences a form of abuse before the concept of sexual harassment was introduced, and hence not really being able to effectively understand the kind of discrimination or injustice she was going through, and to even communicate that to the rest of society. A related concept is that of testimonial injustice, where in an interaction, the speaker's credibility is reduced due to a prejudice that is being held by the hearer. A very practical example of this process is in the context of the US or the UK, can be that of a policeman who does not believe a Black person due to their skin color, or, for instance, in South America, a police officer not believing an indigenous person. So, in order to address these types of injustice, Fricker proposes the development of virtues. Specifically, on the one hand, we have testimonial justice that is considered to be a virtue of the hearer that helps them detect and also correct their prejudice regarding the credibility of the speaker. For instance, that refers to becoming aware of our own racist or sexist outlook and trying to change our judgment regarding the speaker's credibility. On the other hand, we have the notion of hermeneutical justice, which is a virtue that allows the hearer to critically reflect on the fact that there is a lack of language and concepts in order to enable the speaker to make sense of and to also communicate their social experience. So then, thanks to this understanding, the hearer can adjust their credibility judgment of the speaker. A practical example can be the recognition of the structural discrimination that exists, once again, towards women within a society. For instance, in relation to their voices not being heard, or their work not being fairly remunerated, or their inability to hold leadership positions. Or, for instance, the fact that if within a group, within a mixed group, if women share an idea, it may not be taken into consideration. But if a man raises their hand and shares exactly the same idea, it will be valued just because it's been shared by a man. So once we become aware of this structural discrimination, then the next step would be to be able to develop a language and concepts in order to address that phenomenon. For instance, the whole discourse that has been created around gender inequality. And then once we have this language and conceptual resources, we can then think of the next step, that is to take actions in order to address these issues. So after having shared these conceptual aspects, we may ask ourselves, why are these notions and their application important for our work? And that is because when these forms of epistemic injustice occur, and once again, this has to do with the unfair treatment of other systems of knowledge, the participants' credibility can be reduced. And therefore, indigenous ways of knowledge can be destroyed, and there can be an excessive Eurocentric thinking, which is a view where Western civilization that refers to um, the developments that occurred within Europe and North America are held as the most acceptable or the most valuable standards. And this Eurocentric thinking can blind us from actually learning from the precious local knowledge that participants may have, or information that we gather from interventions such as the development project that we looked at in the second example earlier, and research projects. They may be framed in a way that doesn't produce results that are of any relevance or useful to local contexts. Therefore, in order to enhance uh, research practices and to make them more just, it is very important to ensure that we have the ability to listen and to respect indigenous knowledge systems. These can also include the ability to recognize that there may be an interrelation between human, spiritual, and inanimate realms. And equally important, it is to cultivate the qualities of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, and resistance to oppression. And the last one may also mean being able to raise questions related to also examples where indigenous knowledge systems can be oppressive, such as in the case where um, we need to deal with children's rights or women discrimination or other types of discrimination. So it is important to have the ability to question oneself and to question when different approaches are being unjust in different ways. And then it is important to employ research methods, such as, for example, the Ubuntu approach, where the indigenous community is placed at the center of the research process, and there is an emphasis on collaborative aspects, which can all help decolonize the research process. And I will, on purpose, not unpack the notion of decolonizing the research process, because that would entail probably getting into discussion that would take a whole new seminar, and probably we will have a seminar on that. But this, in practical terms, comprises a mix of using like the more conventional qualitative methods and instruments of research, such as what we know as focus group discussions or interviews or open-ended writing tasks or worksheets, as well as those instruments that can be seen as being more eccentric, such as playing games or hearing stories or having sessions with traditional healers or conducting home visits. Other just approaches that can actually contribute to having more just practices are returning transcripts to participants. transcripts from interviews or focus groups where participants can look at them and then they can validate and also provide feedback, but also agree on whether or not to include specific parts from the transcripts and to make meaning in a collaborative way. An example of a tool that can be used is that of photo voice, where a research question is posed to participants and they have to respond to that question by taking a photograph of their own choice. And then that photograph can later be used for group discussions to explore specific aspects. Another approach has to do with community-based research and participatory action research, which are approaches that can employ participatory rural appraisal techniques, where researchers and participants are redefined in equal terms and they become equal collaborators and co-producers of knowledge and research outputs. So we have examples like mapping and diagramming, transect walks, drawing timelines, and so on. But more in specific, I would like to place the emphasis on storytelling methodologies that can enable the communication of holistic knowledge within the context of time, place, and relationship. In particular, the example of yarning, that is conversational process that involves the sharing of stories to develop knowledge. Within this approach, in fact, the data collection takes the form of a dialogical, co-constructed conversation where indigenous participants are granted the power to guide the direction of the conversation without interruptions. So, once again, how do these concepts of justice and respecting systems of knowledge that allow people to express themselves get reflected in our FRN practices? For example, we already have our FRN principles that, if we look at in detail, we will find are very much aligned with the notions of epistemic injustice, or rather epistemic justice, that we explored earlier. But in particular, sometimes it can be challenging to really ensure that all of these principles are translated into practice. So, what more can be done within CCRP and individually as a researcher? Like, what are ways where I can check whether I am actually undertaking an epistemically just approach that includes engaging in an ongoing process of questioning rather than having like a checklist of activities to carry out, because different contexts will require a different way of engaging, so there can't be a general checklist that works in all contexts. But nevertheless, there can be important aspects that we can keep in mind, such as the ongoing self-questioning of one's own and collective practices in the light of the concepts that we have explored. And once there is that critical questioning, then there can be continuous adjustment of our approaches accordingly. For instance, we can ask ourselves questions like, what unique knowledge can participants share on this topic or on this practice? Or how do I provide a safe space for them to feel comfortable to share their knowledge? And how can I then demonstrate that what they are sharing is being respected and valued? Another aspect to take into consideration is the question of whether marginalized farmers or collaborators' perspectives are adequately represented, or is it just tokenistic, which again refers to the fact of checking whether I am only including representatives from the most marginalized groups without ensuring that they get the chance to share their knowledge or that their voices are truly being heard and taken into consideration. Another question to think about is, to what extent do participants contribute to defining the methods used in the research approach? Are those designed following local culture? For instance, are methods like yarning included? And then, is the local framework, the research framework, aligned with the indigenous system of knowledge? For instance, are we incorporating spiritual aspect where these are relevant? Or do local cultural understanding and values play a role rather than us imposing our Eurocentric meanings, which again has to do with the meanings, the views that are related to those of Europe or North America that were developed in the Western civilization and that are held as being more valuable. And also, is local knowledge actually incorporated in the trainings that are conducted with the community? And an example can be that of making sure that we strengthen the synergies between multiple systems of knowledge. An example can be found in Uganda, where there was a combination of two different styles of participation. One was more like a Western democratic approach, and the other one was more based on the local style of participation in order to respect local norms. And in this way, through this combination, one could both ensure that local cultural aspects of reaching consensus, for example, were respected, as well as allowing all participants to share their agency. So, more examples of these synergies would be very helpful to ensure more just practices. I hope that this was helpful. And for those who are interested in exploring some of these ideas in more depth, there is a list of references here, or they can also contact me to share more resources, or if you have any questions or needs clarifications or want to share reflections, we can do it at the end of the seminar, or you can contact me directly at my email address. Thank you very much.